Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The defense acquisition system, as you know it, is dead. That's according to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who promised to completely change how the Pentagon does business. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more of the details. Anastasia, good to see you.
Hi, Terry.
So Secretary Hegseth's been dropping in bits and pieces of acquisition reform through memos over the past couple of months. What are the big changes that he's pushing for now?
He delivered a major speech to industry representatives last Friday at the National War College in Washington, D.C. What he's doing is a couple of things. First of all, he's getting rid of the traditional program executive office structure, and he's replacing it with what's called portfolio acquisition executives, or PAEs. The move to a more portfolio-centric approach to acquisition is featured in both House's SPEED Act and the Senate's Forged Act, and that is right now moving through Congress. The Senate bill specifically uses the portfolio acquisition executive, and one of the sections of the bill kind of redefines that role and provides PAEs with greater authorities and responsibilities for requirements, acquisition, and resourcing. But as for DoD, we don't know much about what their own conception of the new role would be. One thing that keeps coming up, however, is the idea of empowering new portfolio officials to make decisions without waiting for bureaucratic approval processes. Hegseth said DoD is also standing up a new organization called the Wartime Production Unit, and that would be succeeding the existing Joint Production Acceleration Cell. It will be led by a team that Secretary said would be empowered to make their own agreements with vendors and conduct work across multiple portfolios. Still to come, one thing that Hegseth said is going to come out is a new guidance that is supposed to incentivize contractors to build their own capacity. However, the Defense Department would need some authorities from Congress on that. He also said he would begin the effort by overhauling the department's Defense Acquisition University. He actually renamed the university. It's now called the Warfighting Acquisition University. And along with Hegseth's memo, the department also released the acquisition transformation strategy. 5 pillars that are laid out in that strategy include expanding the industrial base, empowering the acquisition workforce to deliver at speed, introducing greater acquisition flexibility through cutting regulations and processes, developing high-performance systems, and improving life cycle risk management. Hegseth's memo already directed the services to begin carrying out a number of initiatives that emerged from those 5 pillars. Here's Hegseth.
So, Anastasia, as we listen to all of this together, and if folks have been collecting the memos for the last 9 months, what now kind of ties them all together? Is there a unifying theme? Is there a constant approach?
Yeah, this is part of what Hegseth calls his war on Pentagon bureaucracy. And these changes include prioritizing a commercial-first approach, cutting red tape, increasing competition, bringing in more non-traditional defense companies. Like I said, transitioning program executive offices or transitioning POs to portfolio acquisition executives. All of these proposals at the same time, they align with what's going through Congress right now. Both of those approaches are pushing for kind of portfolio-centric management and faster contracting.
As you think about portfolio management, and I've read some of the headlines from this speech, he's really focused on speed, but also he says he's willing to take a little risk in the process. How does the department plan to balance that speed versus risk exchange?
Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment Michael Duffy, when he talked to reporters on Monday, said that while speed is at the core of this transformation, it's central to this transformation, the department isn't particularly mandating speed. PAEs will be the ones actually balancing speed with cost, performance, and risk. Duffy said that the Pentagon is shifting from this cost schedule performance mindset to schedule performance cost mindset, putting delivery timelines first, but still expects leaders to use judgment on when to accelerate and when to kind of slow down and pause. Here's Michael Duffy.
One important point here is we're emphasizing speed, but we're not mandating speed. We're continually going to be dependent on the judgment of program leaders who are executing these programs to understand where does the need for speed balance with the risk that we would undertake to cost and or the performance of the system. It's part of the reason we're also hoping to provide the flexibility to the portfolio acquisition executives to be able to move money around and to trade requirements. And so there's certainly no question about the emphasis on speed, but recognizing that there's a need for judgment and flexibility in that triangle of cost, schedule, performance.
It seems like one of the ways they want to address the speed issue is by replacing a lot of studies, like the analysis of alternatives maybe, and perhaps some oversight or changing the way that investment decisions get made. Did they explain more about that?
Yeah. So this is the process that the analysis of alternatives, the process takes place early in the acquisition process, and it's supposed to compare operational effectiveness, suitability, and life cycle cost of alternatives. But they're saying these types of studies, not just the analysis of alternatives, but these types of studies are redundant and excessive, and they usually delay the start of the program. Here's how he explains it.
I think that we can learn more from experimentation and prototyping than we can from an analysis of alternatives. I believe the intent of the proposal was to significantly reduce the use of AOAs, but certainly we recognize there may be exceptional circumstances like specifically when it comes to large-scale weapon systems where we may need to do a study of what an alternative might be. But our intent there is a heavy focus on prototyping and experimentation as the best learning and best connected to the art of cutting-edge technology.
Well, they've put an awful lot of changes on the table now, Anastasia. What do you think will happen next?
Yeah, so the Undersecretary of War for Acquisition and Sustainment is supposed to immediately begin executing this transformation strategy. The services will have 60 days to provide their implementation plans in response to the guidance and the strategy. There is also going to be monthly meetings, and the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment will chair those acquisition acceleration reviews to kind of track establishment of portfolio acquisition executives. And what they're saying is they will, over time, continually adjust as they kind of identify additional opportunities to optimize the process.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, there's lots to continue to watch here, right?
Absolutely.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com.
Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, emphasizes that in government, relationships matter more than titles. On this episode of Lessons in Leadership, McNamara shares how he's led large teams, navigated the future of work, and built trust across agencies. In conversation with Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, he offers practical insights on leading with humility, empathy, and clear communication in today's complex federal landscape.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, and also former Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Phil, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Shane.
You've spent time leading in multiple agencies, including both DHS, DOT. What's something you learned early in your leadership career that carried you over into future positions?
Before I dive in, let me just, for any federal employees listening to this podcast or recent former federal employees, I want to say, I see you, I value you. I thank you for your service on behalf of the American people. I wish things weren't happening the way they are happening now, but just a thank you. So you're right, Shane. I've been fortunate to serve in government twice now. If there's one thing that really kind of speaks to leadership philosophy, it's to listen first. I think back to onboarding at Homeland Security in 2009. Right, I was coming from politics. I was in my mid 30s at that point. I learned you have to listen first. There's always pressure to immediately sort of make your mark. But, I think if you take the time to listen to people, whether that's career staff, whether it's, external stakeholders, build the trust, you will then be set up for sort of longer term success. And, whether it's, responding to, a crisis or just responding to, an employee concern or trying to drive, some sort of, initiative. Employees, they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be respected. So I think that it's that foundational lesson.
In your time in government, you've also held multiple different roles where you were managing personnel, as you've been talking, but personnel and HR policies.
Yeah.
And how did those kinds of people-driven positions affect your leadership style?
I think, if anything, the people-driven positions has made me a better communicator. There's just so much information to process that I had to be able to express what was going on to employees and leadership in a succinct and, explanatory way. And, obviously, during my time at DOT, right, the administration passed the largest infrastructure, bill in a generation, right? And a big part of that at DOT was getting that money out the door, right, quickly. But it also meant that, DOT had to, hire thousands of new employees, right? Here I was, right? I had to learn about all these hiring authorities that we could figure out a way to expedite hiring and meet the demands of what the administration wanted us to get accomplished. And, I couldn't go to Secretary Pete, right, and start talking to him about the intricacies of Title V or OPM regulations for delegated hiring authorities and everything that was entailed there in the same way that I could talk to my HR directors about that, right? So I had to find a way to, get the information to where it needed to be in the form that was most useful to the audience, right? It's sort of like, what is your audience, right? And I think that really helped me cut through what was necessary and what was sort of, fluff.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. And was there a time when you had to make a difficult decision as a federal leader? And if you could unpack that a little bit, how did you work through that challenge?
Looking back, I think one of the hardest things we dealt with was in 2021 as we were sort of, we were all remote. We still had thousands of air traffic controllers that had to report on site. But for the most part, DOT we were doing this remotely. And so, how were we going to bring employees back to the office in a safe way? It really challenged me to think sort of more holistically, realize there's not one answer. It made me be more flexible. We had thousands of employees who now had been, working remotely for 18 months. How were we going to bring them back? And I really relied on, on my team to be my sounding board, to help craft the best approach possible. Where I sat, right, I had the competing demands of balancing the employee concerns with the administration's priority, right? So I think it was very challenging. Employees and people are an agency, a company, an organization's most valuable asset, right? And so, I was deeply committed to ensuring that we did this in a way that was sort of very employee-centered. That, I think, was one of the hardest challenges we solved. And, fast forward now to, 2025 with the Trump administration and just, a full-fledged 5 days a week back in the office. I don't know if anyone's really figured out the magic sauce on this, whether it's the federal government or the private sector. Everyone's still grappling with that.
Yeah. If you were to go back to the start of your career, what's one piece of advice that you would give yourself now?
The first that's really easy is just to take a long view, right? Which is that, like, you can get so wrapped up in whatever you're dealing with in the here and now in that day, and then just kind of take a step back and say, will any of that really matter in 5 months or 5 years? And if and if it matters in 5 years, okay, yeah, invest the time and the emotional energy into it. And I think the other thing that just I would tell myself, and a constant reminder is, people will say, oh, will you meet with this, young person who's just graduating college and looking for a job, or will you meet with this intern who's down in DC for the summer? And I always say yes. Like, no matter how busy my calendar is, I will always say yes. And what I always tell interns and folks starting out, early in their career here in DC is relationships matter more than titles. Early on, right, you're running this rat race, and you're trying to climb the ladder and get to that next rung, and chase the next cool job title. But I think what truly propels someone's career is the network of people, the colleagues, the mentors, the collaborators you build along the way, and the people you work with, right, today may become your partners down the road. So, relationships matter. Invest in those relationships. You have to show up with respect, shared values, mutual trust. But I'd say invest in relationships is just the constant reminder.
Who is one person, it can be somebody you know personally or somebody well-known, who has impacted your leadership style?
You're not going to get me to pick my favorite. But, one thing I will say I took away from my most recent boss, Secretary Pete, was just a reminder why we're doing the work we're doing, right? In particular, I think in the federal government, and, it's so easy, right, to talk in either jargon, acronyms, and so I mentioned earlier the infrastructure law, and so for instance, there's a brand new grant program in the infrastructure law called the Bridge Investment Program, and it was, I think, $15 billion over 5 years to essentially repair, rehabilitate poor or at risk of being poor, failing bridges across the country. In the federal government, we can talk about it as the Bridge Investment Program and $15 billion, right? And, what Secretary Pete always challenged us to do is talk about that in ways that average Americans would understand, right? And so what average Americans understand is if they have a bridge in their community, and that bridge is frequently having detours or lanes of the bridge have to be sort of taken out of service, and that causes delays. Well, we can talk about the investment we're making, and we're going to repair that bridge, and it's going to be more safe, and it's going to reduce delays or detours, and it's going to save you time on your commute. That's far different than talking about a $15 billion bridge investment program, right? Anytime he would always challenge us just to constantly make the work we're doing matter to the American people. And so that's something that I take with me.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Phil. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. This is Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.